So, welcome to Scott Moulton's talk. Scott's from myharddrive.died.com. He's a expert on data recovery, which interestingly enough leads him to be able to do a lot of forensic work. So when you all get popped, he'll probably be the one looking at your hard drive. Just keep that in mind. Buy him beer now ahead of time. But let's give a big round of applause for Scott. He's got a great presentation coming up.
Just a kind of a quick show of hands. Who saw my speech from last year? Okay, that's pretty good. Because this one's kind of like the part two, but it's, like let's follow a theme kind of thing. Last year I kind of did the talk on the general things that you can do with data recovery on the hardware side. I don't really focus, at least in these talks right now, on the software side. I focus mainly on the primary things that are hardware related that may not be specific to your OS or what version you're using, because I do all of them. I do Mac OS, I do Linux recoveries, RAID recoveries, whatever is necessary. And then obviously doing data recoveries and running a data recovery company keeps me really hot on the topics dealing with forensics. And coincidentally, one of the weird things that's starting to happen in forensics is that hard drives are being made crappier than they've ever been made before. So we're starting to see a lot more failures actually on the job. Like you actually have a lot of bad blocks on drives when you're out there trying to do an image and trying to recover it and take it back to your office and work on it or whatever you do. How many people do forensics in here? Okay, that's pretty good. So I'm trying to focus on the things that I might do as a forensics person when I'm out in the field trying to do those recoveries and trying to help you guys at least come up with ideas and answers to get those images done, because a lot of forensics guys just can't get the image done if there's actually some failure with the drive, and in a lot of cases they have to. They got to figure something out. So I even try to handle like a forensics department in data recovery, so that if we have a special hard drive that we need to reassemble but it still needs to be acceptable in court, we try to do that. But real quick, before I get into the hard drives, I've been starting to deal a lot with SSD drives and flash memory sticks. There's still, it's kind of a lot like it is with hard drives, where there's very little information that is very detailed in what's actually happening. And I've been trying to build those contacts and trying to get answers, and I've gotten a few answers from a couple of guys at SanDisk and a couple other companies. But for the most part, anything that's related to like trade secret stuff or how they're doing wear leveling, it's all hidden. You just can't find it, or no one's going to tell you. The white papers in some cases have inaccurate information in them, or they were written in 1998 before M Systems was bought by SanDisk. There's been a lot of different things along that line that affect our doing a data recovery. How many people have had a flash memory stick like die on them and had to try to get data off of it? How many people were successful at getting the data off of it? Yeah, that's a little less of a number there. And just real quick, I mean, how'd you do it? Did you have to rebuild it, like resolder chips on? Okay, so it's software side. It wasn't hardware side. Okay. All right, so that's lucky if you can do it with the software side. A lot of times, dealing with hard drives and things like that, as you well know, there's sometimes that you just can't deal with things that are the software side. So basically, I'm going to kind of go into the structure and what happens with the flash memory chip. And a standard memory chip, almost every single thing is actually in existence on the memory chip itself. The control chip, there's always been questions about what actually happens in the control arena here and what's actually on the flash drive itself. It's still a fairly dumb device. It basically does some basic like ECC checking to make sure that the block that it just wrote is actually a good block. The idea of wear leveling is I'm going to use every block on the chip before I write anything else to another block that's already been written before. So in other words, like an erase cycle. The thing about flash is that you have blocks that are divided up by the hardware when the chip was manufactured and made for this particular device. You have to erase an entire block at one time. So if you say have two files that fit in a particular block and one file was deleted, the second file that exists in the block is going to keep the first file from being deleted. So even though the operating system and what you might normally do in forensics, where you're actually going to try to recover content that's been deleted, you won't see it. It's kind of like a virtual OS. Now, in the control chip basically controls most of what actually happens based on driver calls. So almost everything that you see here in this particular diagram actually happens in a driver. It does not happen in the chip itself. The chip is not really smart enough to do much more than move things around and go through like a garbage collection routine based upon what the wear leveling schemes are asking it to do. So in this particular area where you see this block of items that's called the true FFS, that is the area that is basically controlling how many times that you're going to write over a space before a block can no longer be used again. The blocks have a maximum amount of time they can be erased. Your life cycle is basically about 100,000 writes. So most people actually put content on their flash drive, and then they don't erase the file. They just basically keep rereading it. And so this doesn't put any kind of limitations on your reading. It only puts limitations on your write cycles. So true FFS is supposed to basically move the files around so that you can do an erase on a block and maintain a longer lifespan for a sector or a block before it is destroyed. Now, the big deal here is that in some cases with SSD drives, which are the solid state drives, they're just now coming around. I actually have a laptop that has an SSD drive in it. Does anybody know what an SSD is?
It's basically flash in the form of a hard drive.
Right, a solid state memory device. So the whole point is, like, you can take your laptop now and you can shake it or something and not have to worry about the head whacking the platter as the drive is spinning. It also uses a lot less power. The issue is with SSD devices is, for the most case, there is no actual driver. That apparently is not true with like hybrid drives or something of that nature. A hybrid drive is a hard drive that also uses memory. It's a combination of the two that are added together, and there's support for it in Vista and things like that for the 5 people that are using Vista. But outside of those people, SSD is basically your other choice. And right now, say for instance, a SanDisk SSD drive that's about 32 gigs is about $600. There are other drives that are about the same, that are faster capacity, higher end capacity, that are in the $2,000 range. And this is just for the drive itself. But you have some added bonuses there, which are that you drop your drive, you don't lose anything, your head's not whacking the platter, it's a lot faster, and you also have better battery life on your laptop. So right now, my Sony is getting about 5 hours of consistent and constant use while you're sitting there clicking on the mouse itself while you're using it. There's kind of a downside, though. Certain manufacturers, like SanDisk, there is a additional socket. There's something called the ZIF socket. So if you take your SATA drives and your PATA drives in a smaller laptop like a subcompact, you'll have a ZIF socket. So you'll have like a 1.8-inch hard drive that has a ZIF socket on it. And there's 2 types of ZIF sockets. But SanDisk saw, for some reason, decided to make their 32 gig ZIF socket drive a master only. So if you happen to have a laptop and you decide to upgrade to a SSD drive in my laptop because it's going to be really cool, you need to find out whether or not your CD-ROM shares the same IDE controller, because when you put the SanDisk drive in, it's going to disable your CD-ROM drive because it's master only. You don't have a jumper, you don't have a way to change that. So just to kind of help you not make a mistake and not have a CD-ROM in your laptop, you need to pay attention to that and make sure that you actually have like 2 IDE controllers and that what you're plugging in is not going to stop the other one from running. In the case of flash memory, when we're doing a data recovery, most of the time it's the same kind of thing that we're going to have to do with a hard drive. We're going to have to find an identical and exact match for the type of drive that we're going to fix and replace. And basically at this point in time, you're looking at unsoldering the chips from the board and replacing them. So you've already got to remove the good one and actually get rid of the chips off of it and then solder them back on. And I have a fancy soldering gun, so I'm sure that all of you have that one that does it that quick. It is very, very difficult to unsolder these things. Heat is a real problem, and I'm getting better and better at doing this, but ultimately the whole point is that all the content that you need for your operating system is typically on the chip itself. The big deal is whatever the control chip is doing to write the content, making sure that the firmware and that the model is exactly the same, because it's, again, it may be I'm going to write a block someplace else on a different model. So you have to be really cautious about dealing with those flash drives. You can rebuild them and you can replace them. You cannot probably take the chip off, image it, and do something with it. It is written in a special format that is completely unknown at the moment. I'm still dealing with trying to get some information on how it's written, because my thought process is that if you have a block and the block has to go through a cycle for an erase, If you're doing forensics and there's 2 files that are on there, you may have thought that you already deleted and wiped a particular block and your file is gone. But in forensics, the file is probably still there. Just like it is on a hard drive when you do a delete, the only difference is that you can't really do a wipe cycle, or you can't really do an erase cycle like you can with a hard drive and still go back and get the data, from a standpoint on the flash drive. So it would be nice to know if we can actually take a chip off, copy the chip, and then get the content out of the chip that you thought was already erased. So you can see with the benefit there. So you pretty much need to kill your flash drive with a hammer is probably a good idea. Don't sell it on eBay or whatever else, because at some point in time I think somebody's going to actually figure out how to decrypt these chips and actually be able to recover files you thought were long gone. So I've had quite a few. This is a really cool thing about not only doing forensic but data recoveries is you get the whole story. People they don't just send you a hard drive and say, please fix it. They send you their life story and a book and please, and there's nothing wrong with that. It gives us a lot of insight into what kind of content we're going to find on the drive or whatever when we recover it. Naked pictures of my wife, and we try harder to recover those hard drives. So it really does help sometimes, get us into the job. But there's quite a few. There's a couple other stories that are coming up in the same kind of thing. But I do get a lot of these where the guy is typing an IM to his girlfriend while his other girlfriend is right behind him. And that causes the laptop to be thrown out of a window and into a pool. It happens often. One of the hardest things for us to deal with is this clicking noise. Anybody ever had this hard drive that has this clicking? Yeah? Everybody. They say that only like 3% of hard drives are failing. Yeah? That was more than 3% in this room, I think. But the whole point is that dealing with this clicking noise is one of the most difficult things that you can do in a data recovery. And I just wanted to explain and go through the process of what happens at this point in time, and then some things that you can do to fix it. And some of the things that can fix it also fix other problems, like firmware problems and things along the way. So I'm going to kind of break that down and go through some of the components. But I need to teach you a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about and what those areas are. Right now, I'm going to be dealing with this area in this talk that's over here where the actuator arm is, that goes all the way back underneath here in the IC board. In previous talks, I've talked about the spindle and the platters and how to deal with some of those items. And if you go on the internet, you'll be able to see there's plenty of other talks. And all the Toorcon talks from last year were posted already online. I think Hikari already put them on Google Video or something. So when you go through a power on routine, you first power up your hard drive. Basically, the very first thing it's going to do is it's going to try to check and see if all the electronics are in good shape. So it's running through a process, and it's very quick. It's almost instantaneous. It does a self-check and make sure all of its components there. And there's one particular component that has to pass through, which is called preamp. I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. After the self-check runs, and it says, okay, fine, I'm okay, then it starts to do the spindle spin-up. Now, this particular piece that's blinking over here on the right, the red, that is basically a locking mechanism. This is one of the pieces that is gradually changing in all the hard drives, and it is almost gone. As of the middle of last year, it was the normal thing you would see in every drive. It is basically a little tiny piece of plastic that teeters based on airflow. When the spindle starts to spin up and the hard drive starts to spin, it creates airflow. And as soon as the amount of airflow is significant enough, it will teeter this piece of plastic out of the way. And at the other end of this piece of plastic is the locking mechanism that keeps the head arm from moving. Most of the ones now that have like the instant I'm going to power off your hard drive because we have an accelerometer in your laptop and we saw that you dropped it and we want to turn off the power in your laptop and hopes that you save that drive. How many people have one of those in their laptop? How many people have had one of those fail? Like you dropped your laptop and you still couldn't do a data recovery from it. It happens. I've seen them, so they're still out there. They're still a problem. It doesn't power them off fast enough. It has to have a fairly decent size fall in order to turn it off so that it can park the head fast enough. But some of the parking mechanisms now are becoming electronic. They're actually still simplistic and based on magnetic force, but when power is applied in a certain place, it basically jerks the arm back and then locks the pin. So this is changing a little bit. It really doesn't affect data recovery from that standpoint. You still do exactly the same thing as far as that goes. There is another change coming up that does affect data recovery. After it does that, and that teeters out of the way, the heads will then have enough airflow to cause them to float over the platters. So this is the part that's getting a little touchier now. Basically, it had a pretty good distance before like 2001 that the head would not actually hit the platter under small conditions of being whacked. But because our heads are more sensitive now, they move them closer to the platter. So now we have a bigger problem again where if you whack the hard drive, it actually hits the platter itself. And how many people have one of these like free agent hard drives? Anybody bought a Seagate free agent? No? Have you noticed that most of the hard drives that they have now, they stand upright? It's like a design decision for external hard drives where they're standing upright physically. I get an email almost every day from maybe at least 2 or 3 people where that hard drive that was standing up, that somebody bumped the table and it fell over. And then the head whacked the platter. Now, I think it's a pretty bad idea to have your hard drive standing straight up, unless you have it in a really secure place where you're not going to knock it over. So just keep that in mind and be very cautious because it's a common thing that happens. And people tend to put them like on the edge of a desk and then they flip over and it's gone pretty much at that point. So there's a lot of work to rebuild those and they're pretty hard to do. So after it does that and the head finally has come out of its park position, it basically goes through the servo timing, the reading. It's the head itself is actually reading content off the platter about what its timing is and kind of syncs up with firmware at that point in time to try to resolve my geography, where things are going to be, where the head's going to actually sit. And then, depending upon the type of hard drive that you're dealing with, you have what's called the SA area. The SA area on a 3.5-inch hard drive, and I'm going to get into the SA area and kind of explain what everything is here in a second. On a 3.5-inch hard drive, the SA area is typically on the outside edges of a platter. On a 2.5-inch hard drive, a laptop hard drive, it is typically on the inside rings of the platters. So that just knowing where that geography is and where those things are can make a difference. If you're opening up a drive and you look at it and you see a scratch in a particular place, it can start to make sense to you why you're having this particular problem. So I'm going to go into that and kind of break that down. I got that hard drive too. I was actually able to fix that hard drive because I went through the logic board, not through the platters. Okay, so the system area. What is the system area? Basically, most people know that you have some calibration area or you've had these negative cylinders or maintenance tracks. Most people still have called them negative cylinders or reserved area. Basically, the content that's in there is things like your smart logs, your system logs, your serial numbers. The hard drive in older hard drives, the serial number usually came from the PCB board, the circuit board on the drive. Nowadays, typically, it is in the SA area on the hard drive for probably the last 4 or 5 years in most hard drives. It is physically written into an area, into a platter area that you don't normally see where your data is. And when you boot up, it'll read that content, and then that's how you actually get the serial number in your BIOS when you're booting your hard drive and looking at it. If the SA area is messed up, you typically will not get your serial number at that point in time. So you kind of have to know which hard drive it is you're dealing with. So if you see the serial number, yeah, I'm lucky enough I'm able to actually get the content. If not, then you at least know where you probably have a problem. And then the P list and the G list, I'm going to go into those two components. Those are typically your bad block tables. The rest of the stuff is based on firmware and things that can be loaded onto the hard drive, like extra test routines and things that the manufacturer, an individual manufacturer made that they might want to test a particular hard drive for. And then, again, your passwords. Some of your passwords are there as well. So if you have something that can delete part of an SA area and it knows where the password is, that's how you can get access to your drive again if you... And some of those are also done through jumpers or through pins on the bottom. All right, so I want to describe to you how this is done. This is how items in the SA area are stored. Basically, it's groups of these sectors that are together. Typically, you would say, I've got 3 sectors, and these 3 sectors equal what's called a UBA block 1. That's the utility block address mode. All it's saying is that when a hard drive is manufactured, they wanted to put code or they wanted to put a particular location on the hard drive, but the size may be different. Like I have a bad block area, and that bad block area may always be a maximum of 3 sectors. They just want to call it one thing, so they call it UBA block 1. So this is how manufacturers talk to their own hard drives. And why this matters is that there's some really high-end utilities that in typical cases are fairly expensive, and you may not ever see them. But if you want to find out what's wrong with your hard drive, you've got to talk to these blocks and find out which block is bad if there's a scratch in a particular area. So you may have a UBA block 1 that's fine, but UBA block 2 may be messed up. So I'm going to kind of go through that content. The bad block list. Most people know that their hard drive has a bad block list. Most people don't realize that there are 2 bad block lists. The P list is the list that was done at manufacturing time. And typically, in some cases, it used to be printed on the outside label of the hard drive. They don't typically do that too often anymore because it's fairly large. But the P list is the primary list, and it's stored physically in the SA area. It is typically not changed. It is going to stay the same all the time. There are some tools that allow you to make changes to them, but typically they're not changed. The G list is the list that you know that physically makes changes as your drive is going. It's called the groan list. The groan list is every time your hard drive sees that there's a block, it's a bad block, I can't do anything with it, it'll add it to a table and it'll try to correct itself and try to remove itself so you never see that that's a bad block on your drive. So bad blocks really matter later on when we start to physically get into how we're doing a data recovery. And I'm going to show you where the bad blocks actually kind of play into your data recovery and where they are. All right, so most people know that if you have a hard drive that has multiple platters, your data is written in a cylinder. Everybody's heard that I have a cylinder. Well, what it really means is that your content is written on the platters sequentially down through all the platters. So if you have 3 platters, it writes on the top, then it writes the next bit on the bottom of that drive and down through, because all the heads move together at one time. So if you have a cylinder, and this is the other question I always get all the time, is like, why can't I just take this one platter and read it, and then go get the second platter and read it? And I've had people who, you know, they've sent me like 2 platters in an envelope and try to do a recovery from it. And there's a definite problem there. The fact of the matter is that that one bit is directly above the next bit on the next platter. And if you have turned the 2 platters at all, the cylinder will never line up again. The hard part here is that the center, where the shaft is basically either one screw or a set of screws. And once you remove those screws, the platters spin independently. They basically are free-flowing platters. So once you've taken it off, there's no easy way to realign them. There is no way to realign them that I know of. So you've got to treat them together as a unit. If you have one single platter, which is some of the stuff I've talked about in my previous talks, and that you could actually do a recovery yourself by taking that platter out and moving it to another. You can only do that with a single platter. If you have multiple platters, there's a special tool that's involved. So previously, I've tried to like keep a limit on what you would spend on tools or do something to like $50 if I'm talking to you guys trying to tell you how you could do your own recovery. But there is this one particular tool that's going to be, you know, about $500 if you're going to do multiple platters. So if you're actually going to get into data recovery, it's a good tool to buy. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. The other important thing about dealing with a cylinder structure is that typically when you format your hard drive and you've used any normal operating system, Mac OS or Linux or any of the others, they make their structures for the partition on a cylinder boundary. The point is that you always know exactly where the beginning of your partition is. So if you have 3 platters, you don't have to scan the entire hard drive. You can do a mathematical calculation to figure out where the beginning of your partition should be. And if you have 5 partitions on your hard drive, you can figure out where that 5th partition is by size and so on and so on. The whole point is that if you scan a hard drive from beginning to end and there's bad blocks on it or you're going to have some physical damage, your hard drive may never survive that. You may try to scan, and that's what most file and data recovery software does. The majority of them scan from the beginning of your hard drive to the end and then give you a big table and try to produce what that table is so that you can do your data recovery. But if you know where your My Documents folder is on, say, a Windows data recovery, you can go straight to the My Documents folder. So you can find the beginning of your partition. You can go through, let's say, you know, your FAT32 table, and then find the sector that begins your My Documents folder and go straight to it. There are a couple of tools that do that. Byteback is one of the only tools that I know of that will actually go and scan for the beginning of these partitions on a cylinder boundary without scanning your whole hard drive. There's a couple others like Media Tools Pro, and there's also some software from Runtime that will also do it. And you can actually go straight to a particular folder and try to do a recovery. Most of the time, if you're dealing with a hardware error where your hard drive is clicking, that's not going to be very helpful to you until you've repaired that problem. So then we get into the heads. Now, this is not Mr. Head. That's another kind of video, and it might be a good video, but it's not this video. So we're going to talk about the MR head. That's the magnetic resisto head. And basically, the magneto resisto head, it physically floats over the platter and reads the content from a bit. This is basically the head that you will know of before pretty much 2001. And 2001 is not too long ago, if most of you remember. Anybody have any idea what the largest hard drive you were using, say, by the end of by 2000? Anybody have an idea? It was in the neighborhood of like 10 gigs, and then there were some hard drives that were 16 gigs, and a few in the 20 gig range. Most of them were already using some new IBM technology, but I mean, if you figure from now, from then to now, we're looking at, we currently have a 1 terabyte drive available, and Hitachi just announced a 4 terabyte hard drive that's available. On laptops, they just announced a 320 gig laptop hard drive. So we're getting into some massive quantities. Now, some of that is due to perpendicular, but we're going to get into that in a second too. All right, so the MR head, basically what it would do, the head of the 90s, which is probably some of the most reliable hard drives that were out there, it was a sensitive hard drive's head, but it was not a real sensitive hard drive head like we have now. And it basically used a resistance method to tell when the bit passed under it. So the difference between that and today's head is that it actually knew at that particular moment by registering when the bit passed under it by doing a high and low value, and knows that you now have a bit that passed under it. Today's head, which is the giant head, again, a different movie, it is much more complex than the older head, and now we have some heads that they're saying are 7-layer heads. So some of the Fujitsu heads that they've been building now have 7 layers. The thing with this particular head is that the green and the blue that are there are basically 2 magnets, and they are in opposite patterns. And what was discovered by, and these guys just got some Nobel Peace Prize award or something just like a month ago for developing and figuring out in the 80s what we now use for the head of our hard drive. Anybody see that in the news? Yeah. So basically the whole point is that you take 2 magnets that are in opposite directions, put a soft piece of material between them, and they will align themselves in parallel. So physically it will look exactly like they're pointing in the same direction until another bit passes under it. Now, the difference is that between the old head and the new head is it knew that bit passed under it then. This head basically does it based upon the bit already passed by, and now it's passed me, and once it passes me, it causes the electrons to bounce around inside the head and determine that it has already passed and it's already gone. So the spot has already passed before it even knew that that particular bit was there. I think that's pretty important, and it actually affects some of our data recoveries from a standpoint of speed. Now, I've given talks previously on longitudinal format, which was what we had up until the middle of last year, until the middle of 2006. Pretty much since 2006 till now, almost every single hard drive has switched to perpendicular recording. And what this means is that instead of writing our patterns long ways across the disk like we have done for 50 years, we're now going to write them up and down. And there were some minor changes in the head that were needed to happen to make this the way it's supposed to be, but physically it has duplicated our size. Almost every single thing that happens now is a 2-to-1 ratio. So in a lot of cases, you had native hard drives up to, say, 500 gigs. And then you get a terabyte. It's basically a perpendicular 500 gig hard drive and gives us twice the space. It depends on laptop hard drives, which size that you're dealing with, but an 80 gig becomes a 160 gig hard drive, and so on and so on. So you have a higher density with a change in the head. It makes it a little bit harder to keep your head aligned if you're going to take your head out and try to put it back in your drive. But it can be done. It just takes a little bit more care. But one of the biggest changes that happened was before 2006, we had a variety of different materials that were used to make the platters. The platters could have been tin, aluminum, a number of different things. IBM has typically used a ceramic glass platter, and basically what happened now when they went to perpendicular, they've got to write down through the platter's material, so everybody had to switch to a glass ceramic type of material because aluminum and other metals interfere with the electronics themselves and how much resistance you have. So the substrate now at the bottom basically is what we're looking at, where it has now gone to a glass ceramic platter. The unique factor that happens here is if your head hits the platter, in a lot of cases it will actually dig a groove through your drive and you can see through it. So when you actually open it up, take your platter out, hold it up to the light if you do that. I don't recommend it often depending upon your situation. You can see through the physical platter. It's also the same as if you have the platter, and let's say one of the bottom platters is scratched. If you put light, if you flashed a flashlight down below while it's still in the casing, and you've opened the top lid of the platter so that you can see what's going on, you can actually see the light come through it, even though the top platter might not be scratched. You'll actually see a light amount of light through the platter. So you can tell right away if it's scratched, and you're going to go through heads like crazy trying to do a recovery. That was another girlfriend that didn't work out for that hard drive, I don't think. She actually destroyed the whole thing. Anybody remember courier modems? Anybody old enough in here to remember a courier modem? Yeah? Did you guys get to where you could tell when you walked by the courier modem that it was sending data and receiving data and how fast it was going? Yeah, you kind of got used to it. It's like you see these blinky lights on a front of a courier modem, and so, you know, if you're a bulletin board guy or something like that, you could almost tell who was on. It was kind of like you could read the lights. That's what happens in data recovery. The data recovery software is very similar. It is a fairly, almost all of them have agreed on some of the nomenclature that actually happens. And this bar that you see, this gray bar across the top, if you start using any actual data recovery software that's used for high-end stuff, and even some free software, there's a guy in Russia who wrote a package that's called MHDD, which is a terrific package. It does a great job of like scanning a hard drive and telling you, certain things. It can actually bypass the BIOS on your computer and talk directly to the hard drive. So in some cases where you can't even talk to the hard drive through the computer, it'll skip that. There's also, I would recommend anybody who's actually getting into data recoveries to try to get an Adaptec 1200A controller. It's an old RAID controller, but they're like $12 on eBay or something. This particular software knows how to talk to that controller and that board better than it does most other ones, and there's better error recovery and better error correction going on, and you'll have a better chance of actually getting your data off of it. And just spend $12 on the board and just plug it in and boot on this free piece of software, MHDD. And it'll look a lot like this particular bar across the top. There'll be other content, and it's a little scary. You have to kind of get used to the commands. But I don't want to go through each and every error because they're very detailed. There's a lot of content that goes on there. But it does look a lot like watching a courier modem, and you can start to see what's actually going on. The big one there at the end is the UNC, which means it was uncorrectable. For some reason, I was not able to actually read a particular block, and then it will cause an abort. That is typically what's happening when you have this SA area. Now I'm going to take a look at the arm here. On the arm, physically, you have a chip, and this is a preamp. In a previous speech, I showed how the heads of the hard drive worked a little bit better. It's a lot more like a speaker than you would ever believe. Basically, the content that's written to your platter is not written in zeros and ones. That's a common misconception. People think I got a 0 and I got a 1 on my hard drive. It is more like a sound wave being encoded and written to your platter. It is actually a waveform and physically causes that up and down signature, and it's not as smooth as a high and a low, and I have a 0 and a 1. It's encoded and written to it. So on the way back out, it has to be re-decoded and then passed through a physical amp, basically, is what you're looking at. So on the board, there's this preamp, and it basically increases the value of the signal coming from the head after it's been read from the platter. Now, there's two types of preamps that I know of that are on physical drives. One is actually soldered on, and physically is a chip. The other one is actually done with glue. Basically, they make a little circuit board, they put a little drop of glue on it, and they slap the chip on it. What do you think happens to this when it gets really hot? Yeah, I think the chip falls off, or it causes a problem with a connector or something like that. The real problem is that there's no easy way to tell if the problem that you're having is the preamp. You either have a problem with your head, you have a problem with the circuit board, or you have a problem with this preamp. What ends up happening is it's actually easier to replace the entire arm with the heads on them than to try to go and replace the preamp itself. And the voice coil, again, is another thing that I have talked about in a previous talk where I tell you how it works and go through the whole structure of how it's basically the tail end of a speaker. The issue here is that sitting above this, there's a piece of metal. And it's going to fly down in a second, and you're going to see it. If you're going to take the arm off of your hard drive, if you mess with this coil in any way, shape, or form, it will completely mess you up, and you will not be able to use this arm, this head, any piece of this. So you have to be very cautious. You don't stick a screwdriver in here and pry this piece of metal off. It is only held on typically with magnets. In some cases, there's a screw on each side, and you take the screw off, and then it's very powerful, and you have to pull very hard to get it off. And you actually use another magnet to pull it off. You basically are going to put a magnet on top of it and pry it off with a magnet from the top. But don't stick a screwdriver in there. That's pretty bad. All right, so the cause of the click is basically going to end up being one of four things. You're either looking at this scratched area, which you'll know right away if you see on a platter. If you opened up your hard drive, and let's say you made kind of a clean environment and you put a HEPA filter. I have a clean room. Not everybody does. There's a couple of ways to make a clean room or a clean box. But if you're going to mess around with a data recovery and you don't want to spend $2,000 or do something else with it, you may as well screw with it yourself, because it's the only way you're probably going to see your data if you're not going to spend, I typically charge around $600, $700 depending upon the type of drive and what I'm dealing with on a standard drive. But most of the other higher end companies are typically charging around $2,000. You still struggle with it in the middle of that quite a bit. But if you're not going to spend at least that, you can take it apart, take a look at it yourself, just try to do it in the cleanest area possible. But if you see a scratch like this, then you typically know you're looking at your SA area, and that's what's causing the click. That it's not the head, that it's not the arm itself, that you may have head damage if you got a scratch like this, but it's not typically going to be the head itself that actually is the problem. So your other area is the head itself right here. In a lot of cases, this head is still good. If I can actually back the head off and do something else with it to repair or to replace it, I can still use this head. Then you have the preamp, which you just may as well, again, replace the whole thing. You just have no idea if it's going to be the preamp or not. And then you physically have your PCB board. Now, in previous talks, I talked about this part too, where it's fairly easy to replace. I'm going to try to do a couple of different things with this particular board now and try to show you what I might be able to use for a recovery. So, in this particular case, I'm going to try to do what's called a live swap. This works in the neighborhood of about 25 to 30% of the time on a hard drive. Basically, you still have the same process. You've got to find another hard drive that's identical, as close to matching as possible, that you can use for what's called a donor drive. I need a good drive that can actually boot and run in order to repair a bad drive, in order to get what I need off of it. Now, if I power it up, I connect it to my computer, and I'm going to tell you something that like everybody always says, don't ever do that. Don't plug your hard drive in while it's running. And so I'm actually going to connect it to a computer, and I'm going to have it physically running. And while it's running, I'm going to put the hard drive to sleep. I'm going to tell it power down, which like in Windows you can tell it like 3 minutes. You can use other tools. There's Linux tools that allow you to put your hard drive to sleep. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. But you're going to say, go to sleep. I don't need you. And it basically is going to like kind of hibernate. The platter is going to stop spinning. That's your key right there. When the platters are not spinning, that your hard drive is asleep, but it's still powered on and still connected. Then you pick up you basically have 4 screws on the bottom. You take those screws out, and be careful not to let the screws like roll around on your board. Okay? That's bad. That's really bad. And if you see smoke, you can just stop. That's smell a funny smell, need an air freshener. If any of that happens, then you can just stop and get another hard drive and try all over again. But you don't want to mess up your bad hard drive any worse than it already is. So as long as the good hard drive is the only one that failed, then you can find another one on eBay then buy another one on eBay. So then you're going to take those screws off and you're going to move it to the bad hard drive. So we move the good drive to the bad hard drive. Okay? Physically, the board, while it's powered up, still running, the operating system still thinks it's there, my computer is still running, everything is still going, and I put it on the other drive. Now what's going to happen is it loaded the SA area from the other hard drive. It loaded the serial number, it loaded your bad block tables, it loaded the P list and the G list, not just the G list. It loaded everything. So as far as it's concerned, it is the other hard drive. And so when you tell it to wake back up, it is not going to reinitialize. It is not going to go back and say, let me read the SA area again. It's going to actually power up and pretend to be the other drive. Now, the reason I say that this only works, say, 30% of the time is that there's other things that can cause problems. Like, for instance, okay, now your heads are trying to read a block. It is a bad block, and now it needs to write it back into the bad block table. So now it's going to try to go and move the head to the SA area and try to write to it. It may fail at that point in time. So I would say imaging is the best way. You don't want to use a piece of software that says, I want to scan my hard drive from beginning to end and find my files. You want to image it. So there's programs out there. If you're using Windows, you can use like FTK Imager. You can use any program that can image your hard drive from beginning to end. There are some ways to do it with other tools, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But the whole point is if you have an image of it, the nice thing about images too are whatever you've already captured and you've already written, let's say you use DD and you say crawl from the beginning to the end, whatever you've already captured and already written, you've already got, even if it fails. You may have enough, so you have a 500 gig hard drive, but you're able to image 200 gigs before it fails. You may have all your data. You know, it may be that you never wrote enough data for it to reach further out, and you never have anything above that 200, 300 gig mark. So it's possible for it to work, and it's possible for you to get a recovery that can work. But still, you have to have this duplicate hard drive, and that's always the pain. You have another option, which is called imaging in reverse. Now, most hard drives today have cache memory on the drive itself. So some have 4 gigs, 8 gigs, whatever. The point with cache is that it tries to predict ahead of time and read ahead into your hard drive 8 megs, 8 gigs, whatever it is that your cache is. It's going to try to read that far ahead into the drive. So you may not need that file. You may not need what's 8 megs in front of you. You may never even ask for that file. However, the hard drive is going to dive in. It is never going to finish and never complete what you're already on or the file that you're on. It's going to die at that spot and go into a retry mode and basically try to recalibrate itself over and over and over again. That's the clicking noise, is this recalibration. It gets an error. It says, oh, I got to reset. Maybe I'm going to power down. I'm going to go to the beginning of the drive, read the SA area, and start all over again. Well, you don't want that to happen. So maybe it's a problem with memory on this particular board. And you would not believe how often that this is actually true. It is more common for it to be a problem with memory on the board than almost any other problem that I've seen. So what you can do is you can image it in reverse. If you image a hard drive in reverse from the last sector to the first sector, basically there is no cache. It is a pre-cache, so it is reading ahead. It is not reading behind. So if you start at the end of the drive and you moved to the beginning of the drive, it never caches anything except that current block that you're on, that current sector. So there are basically 3 or 4 ways that I know that you can do an image in reverse. There is a program called Media Tools Pro for Windows or a DOS boot disk. It's like $300, $400. There is a piece of hardware that's called Imager, which is called Deep Spar Disk Imager. It's a great piece of hardware. It does a bunch of other stuff, but it's about $4 grand. Or you have the freeway. I bet everybody likes the freeway. That is DD Rescue. DD Rescue has a switch that allows you to actually run it in reverse. And so for free, if you know Linux and you can do it in Linux and you can hook it up, it doesn't matter what OS that you're recovering. It doesn't matter if it's Mac OS. It doesn't matter if it's a Windows machine. If you can hook it up to your Linux box, run it in reverse, get an image of it, then you can go do your logical recovery somewhere else. The whole point is to get the image so that you can do your logical recovery afterwards. You never mess with the original again. So if you can use DD Rescue, and then there's some other add-ons, and there's like a script that somebody wrote that's called DDR Help that does a great job with DD Rescue. It basically controls DD Rescue and tries multiple ways to go and do a recovery. Again, free. So that would probably be my suggestion of a way to do this, and this can actually solve a lot of problems. If you can just image it right away in reverse, it'll solve a lot of your problems. So then we have the really hard stuff, which is the head replacement stuff. And the head replacement stuff will fix this problem physically if you are able to physically pull the heads off and move a set of heads from a good hard drive to the bad hard drive. You basically strip down your hard drive, you remove everything. If you're lucky enough that your hard drive has this ramp, you can actually use this ramp to help realign the heads and put them back on, and it makes it a lot easier. A lot of hard drives now are actually parking the heads on the outside, but there's still a bunch that actually park them on the inside. And basically the whole point, if it's parked on the inside, is that you want to spin the platters manually, physically, either with a screwdriver or something through the center of the shaft. You want to spin it underneath the heads in the same direction that the arm is. So in this particular case, it's going to spin this way. And you physically spin them and move the heads off gradually while you're doing it till you get to the end of the drive, and then you can actually use paper and put the paper between there and hold the heads apart while you pull it off. Now, if the two hit, you might survive. It's probably, at least the preferred method obviously would be to pry them apart and keep them apart from each other. And there's some other people who are trying some different things with plastic straws, like cutting off a little piece of a plastic straw and capping it over the end, especially if they're going to try to store it for a while, maybe when they bought a new hard drive, it hasn't shipped yet and they're waiting for it, but they've already disassembled it. So things like that happen quite a bit. So you can basically take that assembly off and you can move it to your other hard drive. Now you're going to destroy a good hard drive on the way, so it's going to be bad for you if it's like a terabyte or something, but you know, if you've got your 100 gig and you're happy and you can tear it apart, you're going to be good. Pretty much everything that's up to, say, 300 or 400 gigs now you can get for like $80 online somewhere. Your hard part's still going to be matching another hard drive and getting the exact one you need. I'm kind of probably caused a lot of my own problems from that standpoint, because now that I've given, you know, these speeches and told people about it, everybody's out there hunting for it. So now what happens when I call somebody on eBay is they go, oh yeah, you're going to do a hard drive recovery. That's an extra $100 for this hard drive. So it's getting a little worse from that standpoint, but I may have caused that problem myself, so no one to blame but me. And then you have your option of the platter swap. Now, if you have a single platter, it's going to be very easy. Basically, you can do this. I mean, like some of the 20 gig Mac stores, it's a breeze. You basically take off a bunch of screws, move the head out of the way. You don't really have to do much work at it, and you can move it to another drive, spin it up, and go right away. So very easy, great, wonderful. You just basically have to be really careful with your heads again. In some cases, you can do exactly like I did here, where you actually are just moving the head just out of the way and not actually having to disassemble the whole assembly. You probably have to loosen the screws, but it'll work, and you can do it. Multi-platter. This is the tool I'm talking about. This tool looks a lot like a coffee can. Very thin metal, and it's got this V shape right here on the right-hand side. Basically, what's going to happen is there's a little cap inside that is just basically hanging there that will keep screws from floating around on top of the top platter. And so basically, you're going to take this particular tool, and you're going to disassemble all the things around the sides of your platter, and then you're going to be able to actually take your 3 platters, 4 platters. I've done up to 4 so far. And you're going to be able to slide it over them, keep them all aligned, and then this causes the pressure when you push down on this little V shape. When you do that, you'll be able to take out the screws inside, and they'll just sit there on top of the lid of this thing, and you'll be able to. I've tried this also, trying to do it with like a piston compression ring. I'm having a little bit of problems with size, trying to get a piston compression ring to fit in there exactly right. But I think it's possible. I think you can do it. There's been some new changes in the hard drive that I just kind of want to point out before I finish up this part. Around the platters, some new hard drives have a ring, like a metal L-shaped piece that has been showing up in between the platters. Like basically they put up, when they manufactured it, they put a platter on the drive, then they took an L-shaped piece, put it on there, screwed it on, then put the next platter on. I'm still not exactly sure why those things are there. The best I can tell is either got to be vibration or air pressure, or to actually stop someone from doing a data recovery, because it's basically in my way. I don't know how you can pull out this top platter, unscrew the thing, and then line it up and hope you get the next platter, because you can't, you're going to turn them. Even a minute amount will cause you a problem. But if you see this little ring My best guess right now is to hope that you can actually break the spindle out of the middle. Some of the motors on these, like for instance a Seagate, some people's drives when they've been falling over, the capstan where all the platters are mounted on is actually popping off of the motor. And so it's in there just basically floating around. And if you're lucky enough that that's happened and it's complete, you can physically unscrew those screws and pull the whole thing out. So I don't know what to tell you yet if you're running into that. I'm still kind of playing with it, but it hasn't made it to animations yet. So basically what I've got here is one that I've reassembled. I've put the heads together with the paper, and then I've moved the entire assembly. I have been able to realign and get up to 4 platters working again correctly. Your problem here is that in some cases, the closer it gets to the center of the spindle itself, the more likely it is not to be perfectly aligned, that you actually have a little bit more of a problem. It's not 100% perfect, but it seems to work. I've been able to get pretty good recoveries. I've been able to get most, 95, 96% of the drive before I physically am having problems with the heads getting too far in. This particular tool that I'm using, it was like $400 plus like $200 shipping from China or something. I have not found anybody in the U.S. selling them, and only a few manufacturers outside of China or something. So it's called an HPE, a head and platter exchanger. So you can try to find one. Basically, that is pretty much the end. Anybody got any questions? You got like 1 minute. Okay, go ahead. Say that again?
Which manufacturers are using glue for the amplifier?
Which manufacturers are using glue for the amplifier? I think it was Western Digital, I'm pretty sure. You see a variety of things that change quite quickly. So every 3 months, whatever drive you were looking at pretty much changed again. So there's no easy way to know. And like I said, you don't know all the time, too, if your problem was the preamp in the first place. So you're kind of just dealing with the whole head assembly. Yes, sir? It's a 1200A, Adaptec 1200A. It was actually a RAID controller, but it RAID single IDE drives and everything right off the bat. So 1200A. Anybody else? I'm sorry? Is the block next to the system area? What? Oh, yes. Yeah, you're in negative cylinders when you're in the SA area. So 0 is actually right outside the system area. It actually is still track 0 there, and then you move into negative cylinders, and that's typically what they're called now, negative cylinders. And you actually read them. When you read UBA blocks, you're actually reading them in negative. It actually is -1, -2, -20, so on and so on. Yes. No, on Flash that's not true. On Flash, if it knows that it's a wipe cycle, if it knows that it's it actually is doing something different. It's simulating like a virtual thing, and if it's like repetitive numbers, it does know the difference in some cases. I'm not sure how I can prove that yet, but I have seen wipes actually cause a garbage collection, which we can actually see like in JFFS, which is an open source version of. Yeah, I think so too. I think there's not a lot of people who are trying to figure out that a script can actually do some cool stuff with it. But the other thing is too is like if you did a DD rescue -R with reverse, in some cases it may just solve the problem right off the bat.